The Wandering Spirit of the Forest. In a small secluded village at the edge of an ancient forest, there was a legend passed down through generations. The villagers spoke of a spirit, a restless, wandering ghost that roamed the dense, shadowy woods. Those who dared to enter the forest at night claimed to hear faint whispers, footsteps, and sometimes even saw flickers of a pale, glowing figure. The forest had long been avoided after sunset. The trees grew so thick that the moonlight barely touched the ground, and an eerie silence blanketed the woods. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and distant hoots of owls, but even those were rare once the ghost appeared. It was said that centuries ago, a woman named Ilara lived in the village. She was a healer, known for her knowledge of herbs and remedies, but she was also rumored to have dabbled in darker arts. When a deadly illness swept through the village, many people turned to her for help, desperate for a cure. Ilara tried everything, but the sickness claimed lives faster than she could save them. Blame soon fell upon her, and accusations of witchcraft spread like wildfire. One night, a mob gathered, dragging her into the forest. They tied her to an ancient tree deep within the woods, a tree said to be cursed. Her cries echoed through the night as they left her there to die alone. When the villagers returned the next morning, Ilara was gone, her body never found. From that day on, strange occurrences plagued the forest. The villagers believed her spirit had been bound to the cursed tree, doomed to wander the forest for eternity. One late autumn evening, a group of friends from a nearby town heard the tale, and driven by curiosity, decided to explore the haunted forest. They laughed off the warnings of the locals, convinced it was nothing more than an old ghost story meant to scare away travelers. The air was thick with mist as they ventured deeper into the woods, flashlights in hand. The further they went, the quieter it became. The sounds of wildlife seemed to vanish, replaced by an unsettling stillness. The trees loomed tall and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. Soon the laughter faded, replaced by an anxious silence. As they reached the heart of the forest, one of them, Sarah, paused. She thought she saw something move in the distance, a faint white figure slipping between the trees. Her heart raced, but when she blinked, it was gone. She shook her head, convincing herself it was a trick of the light. But then the whispers began, faint at first, like the wind through the leaves, but soon growing louder. It was as if 1,000 voices were speaking at once, yet none of the words were clear. The group stopped, huddling closer together, their eyes darting in every direction. "Did you hear that?" whispered Tom, his voice barely audible over the strange murmurs. "Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. Thank you." Suddenly, their flashlights flickered. The darkness seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing thicker and more oppressive. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as the temperature dropped suddenly, unnaturally. A cold breath brushed the back of her neck, and she spun around, but no one was there. "We need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. But before anyone could move, the figure appeared. She stood just a few feet away from them, her long dark hair covering most of her pale face. Her white dress was torn and stained, hanging loosely from her thin frame. Her eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light, were filled with sorrow and rage. The spirit of Ilara had found them. She raised her hand slowly, pointing at the group. The whispers grew louder, turning into a cacophony of tortured wails. The ground beneath them began to shake, and the trees swayed violently, though there was no wind. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if the forest itself had come alive, angry and vengeful. Panicked, they turned and ran. The forest, once a maze of familiar paths, now seemed endless and foreign. Every tree looked the same, and no matter how far they ran, they couldn't seem to find the way out. The spirit's presence was everywhere, behind them, beside them, sometimes even ahead, flickering in and out of sight. One by one, the group began to fall. Tom was the first. He tripped on a twisted root, and before he could stand, the cold, bony hand of the ghost grasped his ankle, pulling him into the shadows. His screams echoed through the forest before being swallowed by the darkness. Next was Ben, who strayed too far from the group in his panic. His flashlight flickered out, and when it came back on, he was alone. The last thing he saw was the ghost's pale face inches from his own before the light went out for good. Sarah and Lisa were the only ones left. They stumbled through the trees, breathless and terrified. The whispers had turned to screams now, the voices growing more frenzied and desperate. They could feel the ghost's presence closing in on them. Suddenly they broke through the trees and found themselves back at the edge of the village. They collapsed, gasping for air, the oppressive weight of the forest finally lifting. But as they looked back, they saw her, Ilara, standing at the forest's edge, watching them. She did not move, but her eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, were filled with a deep, ancient sorrow. The villagers found them the next morning, shaken and pale, their friends still missing. No one returned to the forest after that night. The legend of Ilara's ghost, once dismissed as just a story, became a warning, a reminder of the restless spirit that wandered the forest, forever seeking justice, or perhaps revenge, for the wrongs done to her so many years ago. And at night, if you listened closely, you could still hear the whispers. In the days that followed, Sarah and Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. Though they were safely back in the village, the shadows seemed longer and the air colder. They stayed inside as much as possible, but at night, when they lay in bed, they could hear the faintest of whispers, Ilara's voice still calling out to them. Lisa, unable to bear the guilt of abandoning their friends, began to unravel. She hardly slept, her dreams haunted by twisted images of the forest, of the pale figure, of her friends' terrified faces. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the ghost's glowing eyes staring into her soul. Her mind was slowly consumed by the horror of that night. "I can't take it anymore, Sarah," Lisa whispered one evening, her voice shaking. "She's still here. I can feel her." Sarah tried to calm her, but deep down, she felt it too. The presence of the ghost wasn't confined to the forest. It had followed them back. Every corner of the village seemed haunted now, as though Ilara's spirit had extended its reach. The villagers noticed the changes in the two girls. Some whispered about curses, others about madness. A few even believed that the spirit had marked them, and they began to avoid Sarah and Lisa altogether. One stormy night, Lisa disappeared. Sarah woke to find her friend's bed empty, the front door left wide open. The rain was pouring, the wind howling through the village, and Sarah's heart sank. She knew where Lisa had gone. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat and ran into the storm, her feet splashing through the muddy streets as she raced toward the edge of the forest. The wind whipped her face, and the cold rain blurred her vision, but she didn't stop. The guilt, the fear, the whispers, they all drove her forward. As she reached the forest, she saw Lisa's faint figure disappearing into the dark, twisted trees. Without hesitation, Sarah followed her. The moment she stepped into the forest, the air changed. The storm seemed to vanish, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. "Lisa!" Sarah called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer. The trees seemed closer now, their branches clawing at her as she pushed deeper into the woods. The whispers returned, louder this time, swirling around her like a storm of voices, all speaking in that same chilling tone. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to turn back. She had to find Lisa. As she ventured further, she came across something she had never seen before: the cursed tree. It stood in the center of a clearing, its twisted, blackened bark looking as though it had been burned by something long ago. The ground around it was barren, and the air felt heavy with a dark, ancient energy. And there, standing beneath the tree, was Lisa. She stood motionless, her face turned upward, staring at something hanging from the branches. Sarah approached cautiously, her breath shallow, her entire body shaking. "Lisa, what are you doing?" she whispered, but Lisa didn't respond. Then Sarah saw it. Hanging from the branches were strange woven charms, made of sticks and vines, swaying gently despite the stillness of the air. And in the center of them, etched into the trunk of the tree, was a symbol, a dark, swirling mark that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly power. Lisa finally turned to face her, but her eyes were blank, empty of life. "She's here," Lisa said, her voice hollow, as if it wasn't really her speaking. Before Sarah could respond, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The whispers grew deafening, and the air around them thickened with a dark mist that rose from the earth, swirling around the cursed tree. Sarah backed away, but Lisa remained where she was, her gaze still locked on the strange symbol. Then the spirit of Ilara appeared once more, emerging from the mist. Her form was even more solid now, her pale face contorted with anger and pain. She floated toward Lisa, her outstretched hand reaching for her. "No!" Sarah screamed, rushing forward to pull Lisa away, but the moment she touched her, she felt an overwhelming cold surge through her body, freezing her in place. Ilara's voice, filled with sorrow and rage, echoed in Sarah's mind. "You brought this upon yourselves. The forest was mine, and now you are mine too." The last thing Sarah saw before the darkness swallowed her was the cursed tree, its twisted branches seeming to reach out like the hands of the dead, and the faint glow of Ilara's eyes as she claimed them both. The village after that night was never the same. No one ever saw Sarah or Lisa again, and their disappearance became yet another dark tale added to the legend of the forest. The villagers whispered that the spirit had taken them, bound them to the forest just as Ilara had been bound centuries before. The forest, once merely feared, became forbidden. The village elders declared that no one should enter, not even during the day. And so, the forest grew wild and untouched, the whispers growing quieter as the years passed, though they never truly vanished. But every so often, on the darkest nights, when the wind was still and the moon was hidden behind thick clouds, the villagers could hear the faint sound of whispers carried on the air, a reminder that the wandering spirit of the forest was still out there, waiting and watching. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please subscribe to the Horror Story Media channel and like this video and share it with your friends. Don't forget to leave a comment.